My background is in user experience design, and quite often as a designer, by the time a project comes to me, I'm looking at the requirements and I'm thinking, you want me to speech enable what? This is, not the best use of speech. It often gets to that point. So really, I think what we focused on the West Coast, at the West Coast workshop is really before, at the point of the sales engagement, there's a discussion that needs to be happening, which is, does speech make sense in this situation? And if so, how? And so hopefully what we get out of this talk today and what we get out of the work we did afterwards is some sort of list or itinerary of questions that can be given to a potential customer or to people who are thinking of selling something to a customer that can help them figure out, well, are we really in the right place here? But actually the talk was inspired because of the workshop that we had last summer, 2010, where one of the people in the room said, does speech ever make sense? And that sort of generated a paper at the 2010 workshop, and then it led to a whole workshop on the West Coast that person unfortunately couldn't attend. So let's dive right in. Some basic information about the workshop. We'll talk about the attendees, we'll talk about the location, original topic proposal, submissions. The findings, which include what we created out of it, which we hope will be kind of a fun, interactive way for people to figure out, should I be using speech and maybe this could be reused. And then we'll have time for some open discussion. So who was there? Sandra Allen from SAPIC, myself, Phillip Hunter from Microsoft. We have Mary Constance Parks, a designer of Nuance, Kimberly Patch, and Kimberly is from Red Start Systems. Nandini Stocker from Spanley, and Silky, and I apologize if I pronounced it. Vitasani from Two Fox, also a designer. Also, over the phone, couldn't attend, but presented but did submit papers. We had Susan Boyce, Lisa Stifelman, Susan Gira, and Walter Rolandi, names you may be familiar with already. Okay, so where and when? We had it in January 23rd. It was at the Two Fox offices in San Jose, and it was a long bout of back and forth discussion. And it was piggybacking on the Avios Mobile Voice Conference, and that's why we could get everybody together at that time. So the topic that we presented, and by the way, some of the statements on this slide will have to be revisited by the end of this talk. We came in by saying the time of irrational exuberance regarding speech technology has died down. And I think that most of us can generally agree that there was a time, 10 years ago where people said, everything's going away except speech. Speech is going to be the way you do everything. And I know there have been keynote talks recently that have suggested that. But I think most people who are, on the ground doing the work know that we have tempered that somewhat over the years. And that speech can work well with other modalities. Now we're ready to step back and say, well, what role does it really play? So that's what the second bullet point says. Fewer voices are still suggesting speech being played everywhere, replacing all other UI modes. And now that the reality has sunk in, can we rationally ask, how do we really take hold of the speech modality and use it where it makes the most sense? And how do we look beyond blanket replacements and apply speech strategically and tactically within a variety of user experiences? Why is this not progressing? There we go. Now, before we dive in even further, I just wanted to define some terms that we had to get clear beforehand, because we had a lot of trouble going into this about the difference between modalities, channels, what a modality actually is, and just defining our terms. We're talking about speech as a modality, okay? In other words, as opposed to speech technology. Okay, speech technology is a means by which we can use speech as an input. But you can imagine, for instance, lip recognition, is another technology that could allow for speech as a modality. So we just want to make it clear that speech can be an input modality or an output modality, but so can touch. That's another modality, and one could probably imagine many others as well. So So the submissions that we got from everybody varied dramatically as to how they understood the statements on the slides a few slides ago. So, for instance, one of our talks was about modality preferences across languages and cultures. The person who wrote that paper was mostly in the area of dictation, but they did have also a lot of insights about IVRs, and so there are cultural differences in terms of people's approval of speech recognition or speech as a modality, how they deal with it, etc. Like if you say briefly describe the reason for your call, according to another speaker at this conference, in the Latino culture, that's kind of, I guess, a tall order. That's not my statement, that's theirs. That, it's a very talkative culture, and many of, I'm not going to say that about all Latino culture, but that briefly described is kind of a misnomer. Other talks were about speech truisms. So speech makes sense when it is the easiest, fastest, and most convenient way to get the task done. So for example, maybe on handheld devices, maybe not on desktops when you're trying to browse the web by voice. So there's no surprise there, and maybe that's how it is. Maybe it's not a surprising thing. Just you take each situation one by one, you look at it objectively and say, well, speech would not make sense here. But there's no hard and fast rules we can use. Another paper said, why do we have to ask the question at all? Are we feeling defensive? Why can't we just, go in and say, sure, let's try it out, and not be so, self-deprecating to even ask this question. Now, here was one that is going to launch into the next slide, which is speech, both input and output, should be available as a modality on every device and in every context. And that's contrary to what you saw a few slides earlier, in which I had written the description of the talk as saying that we're more tempered now and we're not going to be promoting it everywhere. And we'll get into more detail about this in a moment because it's an interesting distinction that's made. We also discussed whether speech makes sense depends on both the application as well as the situation of the user. So we can't just say, for instance, doing something on a mobile device is, a good reason for speech because there's other things in play. Is the person walking down the street? Are they in a noisy environment, etc. And then the person who had started the whole discussion at the previous workshop had suggested that one cannot make a compelling case for the use of speech technologies anywhere, either as an input modality or an output modality, because there has been such disappointment with the technology over the years. Whether it's in the car, whether it's with dictation software, whether it's on a handheld device with voice search, it's just there's too much negative press out there. Oop, that's backwards. So we spent most of the day sort of going back and forth about this topic of does it belong everywhere as a modality? Or should we as designers have a responsibility to say to people, look, we really don't suggest you use speech in this situation. The person is trying to, is working in the control tower of an airport and, there's no messing around here. Any room for error, there could be, major problems. But others suggested, no, you can employ speech as an option everywhere. It's a question of where you promote it as the primary modality, right? So that's the key takeaway here, is that you can say, yeah, let's put speech in there because there's somebody out there who might just love it. But in terms of how you design and how you document, etc., you can certainly push speech to the background, or you can put it right up front. Sort of going off track for a second, I've just started using Drag and Go on the mobile phone, and I've noticed that, by the way, that's not a shield, I work the speed cycle. But I noticed that the initial screen, when it comes up, is just a big old microphone with a button right in the middle, okay? There is a text field at the top, but yes, you have to tap on the text field to bring up the keyboard.
Sean goes old school with his mobile phone. Pulls it out of his back pocket.
That's right. I still use carrier pigeons. But it's right there, and it's clearly the promoted interface in that situation. So, you can imagine another design where, the microphone's off in the corner somewhere, and then it's sort of a even promotion of both modalities, etc. So it's really up to the designer. But promoting speech everywhere, Why not? So we decided to go in a little further and say, well, can we come up with, well, at a high level, the conclusions were whether we use speech in a certain situation, and I should clarify, whether we promote speech as the primary modality. You can put speech everywhere, but whether we promote it as the primary modality depends on the following variables at a high level: the environmental context, the user's role, the user characteristics, interaction context, such as, where are they? And form factor and technology. If it's a smaller device, perhaps speech is more arguable. And one that we walked away with saying type of application, but that was really hard to cash out on afterwards when we were writing it up. We never really got to detail that one. And we figured, well, wait, the type of application is not really a determinant of whether you use speech or not, because there's as many applications out there in the world. I mean, there's so many applications out there in the world that it's hard to decide, is there some category of application that deserves speech more than another? So we took some stabs at it. It was difficult, but that's an open question for the group, and I think one that we're going to continue to discuss offline.
But we acknowledge that type of application was often determined or constrained by the other factors. So it was sort of built in that there would be some amount of constraint on whether speech was good for my type of application, just because we don't have all applications equally distributed in all contexts.
Right. So we came up with, and I want to give a strong disclaimer here, this is a first prototype, an online quiz where somebody can sit down with it and answer a few simple true-false questions about the situation they're building the product for, and come away with a score and decide whether I should be talking about speech as the primary interface, not whether they should use speech, but whether it should be the primary modality. But first, this is the introduction. It says, are you designing and building a product that requires user input? This inventory will help you decide whether you should promote speech as the primary modality for user input. Okay, so the first question, and these are given in randomized order. Your user, and so these are just true-false questions. Your users will often be in noisy environments. For example, city, street noise, warehouse, etc. And you'll notice that these map to some of those bullet points earlier: user role, environmental context, etc. And maybe going into this, we should go in with an imaginary product we're building. And this doesn't have to be software. Does somebody want to propose anything? Imagine you have to build something for a customer.
What's that? A bicycle?
A bicycle. Sure, that's a good one, okay? So, bicycle. And we can imagine somebody might say, hey, you can speech enable gears, right? Fifth gear, sixth gear. It's actually, you might want to take that away with you. I think the answer to that would be true, right? We're going to be in a noisy environment. The costs and risks of making a mistake while performing a task with the product are relatively low. Let's say it's changing gears on a bike, okay? The risk of changing gears the wrong direction is probably low because it's not the brakes, okay? You might slow down, you might lose a race, but no one's going to get hurt. So let's just say true. The percentage of visually impaired and blind users of the product will be about the same as or less than the population at large. I think that's a safe true. Your users will often be entering text into your product while on the go. By on the go, we mean the user is somehow in motion and in control of that motion. Well, they won't be entering text as far as I know. So that would be a false. Sorry, nothing else. Your product will offer a search feature. False. And the reason for that question, by the way, is because with search, you know, that there's so many options that could come. It's not like a true-false question, right? The number of slots underneath that you can hit is so vast that speech, one can make an argument for speech as a great modality for search. I hope that the previous questions, and if it isn't clear why a question is being asked, feel free to Speak up. Your product will include hardware that is hard to break. That's kind of a toss-up with this one. The reason this came up is during the conference, during the workshop, somebody mentioned that, well, if something's really fragile, one could make an argument for speech as a way of not having to, break something. So, for instance, glasses, in opening and closing glasses, you could just say open glasses, go like this, because I've ruined these things by going like that. Of course, there's other things one can imagine, like a button that makes it go like that. But
We're building this bike, so we can say we're building it tough.
let's say we're building it tough. When users find themselves having to interact with the product, it will be within arm's reach. That is true. And the reason we brought that up was, for instance, if it's the heating when you walk in the room, or if it's the TV on the other side of the room, etc., there's a better or stronger argument for speech. And by the way, when we say these things, we're not using extremes here. It's not like if something's going to be right in your hand, then speech is out of the question. That's the primary modality. Your users will mostly be in the age range of, and this is not a true or false, 15 or younger, 16 to 65, 66 or older. Those ages are obviously up for discussion. This is just a template, but as most of us know at this point, speech recognition seems to work better for people in the middle age range. Children, the recognizer does not work as well, and for older folks, it's difficult as well. But let's just say for now that this kind of bike, it's a top-notch racing bike. Let's say it's going to be this group here, 16 to 65. The user's environment can be best described as hands-free, eyes-free. I would say that is a big false. The percentage of dyslexic users of the product will be greater than the population at large. That would be false, as far as we know. Your users can enter text using a keyboard, and the keyboard is at least, well, we can already tell. But this was going to ask about the size of the keyboard, etc. This really has to do with the form factor and the task. Well, I think we're going to have to revisit this question because it assumes that, if I put true, I'm going to put false for now, but I don't think that answer is absolutely right. Something about your users makes you think they would have a preference to speak as opposed to some other method of interaction. So the personality of the person, may just simply, if they're the type of person who likes to talk. Maybe they are a sports announcer, who knows? But for some reason, their personality, they like to speak, and they do not prefer to type. Let's say the answer is false here. The vast majority of your users will be male. Speech recognition tends to work better for male voices on average. I would say this is false. Okay? We don't know who the bike racer is or the just regular cyclist. So this is false. We're getting there, gang. The speech recognizer available to you is the same language as the vast majority of your users. Let's say that's true. Let's say that we have access to many different recognizers and we can switch up which ones are sold in which countries, etc. The percentage of mobility impaired users of the product will be about the same as or less than the population at large. I think we can say false. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. True. Your users have a literacy rate that is the same or higher than the population at large. I should say it should be, the wording should be just higher than the population at large. And I would say that that's false. Okay, and then we submit our answers. I think it's a coin toss with the answers we've given. Be conservative and make speech available. This is just scrolling off the screen. Invisible as an option, but lean toward more traditional modalities just to play it safe. Now, had the answers, I'll show you what I did as the settings, because you might be curious what the secret sauce is behind this.
Is the answer correctly about John?
Yeah, that's their terminology on ProProps.
Okay.
Correct in this case just simply means, yeah, we're leaning towards speech on this one. But it's certainly not a, quote, correct answer.
Okay.
So that's a limitation of the tool, and hopefully if we can build this from the ground up, we won't be using this tool. So actually, I can't really bring it up too easily, what the secret sauce is behind it. It's not that big a deal. It's really just if you got an 80 or above in terms of the quote score, we would say go for it. Speech should be the primary modality. If it's in the large mid-range, below 70 and above 40, we're saying that it's really a coin toss, and underneath that, walk away. You can use speech, but don't make it the primary modality. And obviously, again, once we in the future get to tinker with this a little bit more, lower level ones, there will be some cases where we will do things that have a lower weight and some that have a higher weight. So something like, is this going to be dangerous? You know, is the cost of a failure massive? Then we weight that large scale, and something more like male, female voice is very low level. That's really the results of the discussion. But we would love to talk to you about it now and get your feedback, any questions that you have. If you see things that we just patently missed, please, we'd love to hear it.
Should be a possibility.
Yeah,
Not applicable.
yeah.
That's true, and that was a limitation of the tool, because there was many times I wanted to do things that were, there's more than one right answer. I wasn't able to do that either. So, not applicable would certainly be added if this tool wasn't the fundamental tool. And also we need to obviously fine-tune certain questions, like the one about age, because behind that is not yet the actual data from the academic world and the research labs as to where do you really get the direct drop-off in terms of recognition, accuracy, and age. I know from experience, when I used to work at Dragon on the Naturally Speaking for Kids, that the accuracy was just really low, and that's why many of you probably haven't heard of Naturally Speaking for Kids. So it was trial and error. And during usability testing, which is qualitative, not quantitative research, you could quite often see that there was a lot of struggle for senior citizens using the dictation software.
Try to get more breadth there to be handled more by questions, the answers we allow them to give versus the type of questions.
Yeah, because between not applicable and adding some other options like there's no screen, I think maybe it could, I don't know, you have to see what it looked like, right? After we made some modifications, but it might work as it is.
Right. Specifically, I know with the, I don't know if anybody was at the talk yesterday where the panel where we were discussing the 2010 workshop. But we had given a subset of these as reasons, compelling arguments for speech, and we focused on the IVR. And one was that sort of known long list, like states, etc. That's a very compelling argument for speech. Another one is multiple slots. Now, it was phrased as search here because if we're talking about a larger world, not just the IVR, that way of phrasing it makes more sense. But if we were talking about how may I help you kind of situations, speech again becomes very compelling. And not just when we're talking about like 10 or 12 slots. One could possibly argue for 2 levels of DTMF. But when you're talking about like 150 slots, speech really becomes a compelling interface to start off with.
I was thinking in terms of IVR that many times it's not just input consideration, it's the output in terms of whether speech application is suitable. How to provide the information back to the call.
Yes, and we focused specifically, we said, okay, given that we have one day to talk about this, we said, let's just talk about the input modality, but you're absolutely right.
And that brings up a lot of other considerations too. And there's certainly IVRs out there that present so much information they're not really appropriate for that sort of interaction. A screen involved or some other more permanent visual display. But anyway, we had a question of error.
Did you ever consider making this app speech enabled?
That's great. Didn't even think about it due to time constraints, but now that you're saying that, I'm going to have to take the test.
You could take it one by step. Like, see, you really don't know this. She can talk back to you.
That's right. I
Are you kidding? Give me the response. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I understand the granularity was just true or false, right?
Mhm.
So, but I just wondered if you would consider maybe something like a lighter, so never versus always. And if you include like the not typical kind of, so you feel a little bit more sense of what it is we're trying to capture there.
Absolutely, but that will also take some real tweaking in terms of how we do the scoring at the end. That's not saying no, that's just saying it's going to take some revisions before we're...
Yeah, and our first goal, to probably reiterate what John said, is so these types of questions, I mean, if you've attended speech tech, especially as a speaker for the past 5 years, and everybody wants to know, well, how do I know when speech is okay? And so we're trying to address that sort of fundamental need of like, hey, here's a resource for that. You fill in some things, it's pretty easy, it's quick, it'll take you less than 10 minutes, and give you a ballpark answer. And so this is sort of a replacement for, not really a replacement, it's a widely available resource to give the answer at the end, which is our favorite answer. But we wanted to put a little granularity around that, give people a little bit of space to move. They can go back and play with this. What if I do this? What if I change this constraint, this consideration? You can see how their score changes.
So do you think this is primarily targeted at people who are new to the speech industry, or would experts like use as we find it useful?
I think we can grow it to where experts could find
Yes,
it.
yes. Well, it's funny when the gentleman over here asked the question of would you speech enable this, I was thinking I'm probably going to go through those questions and make a decision. But I think that right now when I was building it and when we were all discussing it and giving feedback, I think we were really thinking about a new audience, somebody who's just built a product and has just dreamed about speech.
Well, but I think, sorry.
Another way to look at that too is even if we have a good feel for something should be speaking about, if our customers come up and say should be, and where's the data to back it up, plug it in here and come with the score to go with your recommendation,
Yeah. We wanted this to serve as a consensus builder, or at least a majority builder in our community. When you come up and ask one of us at the end of the session, is speech good for me? You're talking to one of us. This, at least here, you may not get an agreement from 100% of us, but you're getting agreement from 80% of us.
Even if you're a professional and do it every day, having a structured list of things to make sure you don't forget to consider things.
Right.
Well, I think that is, a primary thing that probably all of us should be aware of is that even if you're very versed in an industry, you should be asking yourself certain questions, and you might lean one way or the other without necessarily running through all of the questions that
Absolutely.
you should.
Yeah.
And so this gives you kind of a self-checker as
Right.
well.
Which is like those of us who are designers know that we shouldn't over-rely on ourselves to remember all the sorts of these research we need to do or something. Somebody at a conference over there recently introduced the concept of the idea of design checklists for experienced, highly skilled designers. Why? Because it's a lot easier to look at a list and say, that, not just a check the box way, but help me remember all the important things that I want to remember.
And I think that possibly another thing that this can do in terms of consensus building is it can help define some of the issues where we have good data to back up when we're asking this question. Here's a case where we pretty much all believe this to be true, but we really wish somebody would do the study.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this has at least the appearance of being an external impartial resource, right? So sometimes we all know that it takes the outside experts to get the opinion shifted the direction it needs to go. We can sit there all day, but because we're the inside wannabe experts, we aren't listening to it. Let me just remind you of avid.org, avix.org. If you're not already a member, we'd love to have you on board with us. This is the kind of thing we hope to do even more of, but that takes people to help and contribute and all that sort of thing.